Hello, hello, beautiful humans. Welcome to another episode of Teach Jenn Tech. And today we have Zachary here. Yay. Thank you for joining us. And Zachary, please introduce yourself and what you'll be teaching us today.
Sure. Yeah. Hi, everyone. So I am, well, where to start? I've been an Android developer for about 10 years. Is probably the easiest way to sum it up. In a more recent life, I was an Android developer advocate, and I'm actually now a manager in developer relations. So I kind of split my time between being someone that advocates for developer relations in general and managing people, and then also someone who absolutely loves Android and continues to try and be an Android developer in what little free time they have. That's kind of me.
That's a good explanation. And I'm excited because so the last 2 weeks, everybody has definitely heard me complain about being back on a Windows machine because I was running to a live stream and I had my laptop in my arm and a cup of water and I ran into a door. Like the door just like I wasn't spatial wise, it just didn't work and I ran into it and it spilt water and fried everything like right before my live stream. So I had to cancel it. And luckily my partner has a Windows laptop. He doesn't use for work. So I had that to use. And I was like, I can't do it. I love all Apple and Mac things. My brain does not function like this. And I bring that up because in my journey of like understanding OSS and open source and also talking about it and realizing, and I think in fact it was like a conversation with you or B Dougie that was like, oh my gosh, I've been talking about open source way longer than I knew what open source was because it was probably 2007 when 2008, Androids and iPhones started really coming out. I worked at Verizon, a mobile company here in the States. And I remember the first Motorola that came out, it was like a slide up and had a full keyboard. And I absolutely loved it. And it was like, yet I kept crashing it because the apps didn't always play nice with each other. Then we got iPhones, and what up, Ryan? Then we got iPhones, and so I was like, "What's the difference?" I learned I would say, closed sourced. That's how I explained it,
Yep.
and I just was like, to explain it to a customer, Android is where it was so customizable, you can change everything, you can really make it what you want, yet there's no guarantee that all the apps will get along together. And then you have an iPhone where you can't customize a ton of it and unless you jailbreak it. And yet it's going to be much more reliable because you can't customize it that much and it just comes as it is. And it was ever since that I've never turned back to go back to Android or Windows. They are not the same, everyone. So please know I'm not saying they are the same thing. They're just much more customizable and not Apple. That
It's very true.
I associate them together. But I loved Android in the fact of so much of it was customizable and it was a lot easier to do a lot of things, change things. From my memory of them and also like a lot of my friends and family have them is it also made it a lot easier to customize the like what are they called, like the on the home pages, but they are like the bigger versions of them.
Widgets.
Widgets, thank you, widgets. iPhones didn't have widgets for a really long
No.
time.
Yeah.
um and Ryan is looking forward to your chat on Tuesday. Yay.
I'm assuming that's a coffee tech chat.
Nice.
Right.
I'm excited.
Continue to do those. That's very good. But yeah, no, you're completely right. You're completely right on Android basically being the open source mobile operating system. And I think today, really, what I want to do is kind of when we talk about Android development and being an Android dev, most people associate that with being an app developer. for Android. But
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to kind of go through the other side of it first today, which is actually looking at the operating system, actually looking at what Android is and how you might develop in the operating system, how you might actually customize the operating system. That's something that I did for many years, and it's kind of not something that so many people have exposure to. So I think it would be quite fun to look at. After that, though, I think we then should look at the Android app side of the world. And I know that we've got another live stream in the future where we will actually then build an app as well. So
Yes.
I think hopefully by the end of this, at the end of today, you'll have kind of an idea of where we're going. And then next time we can kind of really dig into building something fun.
Everyone can probably see that the light is changing, so I'm totally looking up something at the same time of the versions, because I'm trying to see what version I got to before. Yeah, I stopped working at Verizon by the time it got to Froyo.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so very early on.
It sounds like your mic might be doing something. Kind of. Ryan, do you hear that too? I don't know if it's like my headphones or something. It just sounds like it's like a weird connection.
It might be something interfering.
Oh,
Let me.
That fixed it. Whatever you just did. So far, yeah, it sounds like clicking. Yeah, so far you sound great.
Yeah, I think I had a phone too close to my microphone, and it's probably trying to get a text or something. I'm going to move my many mobiles out of the way. Okay.
Yeah, it was. I mean, I might have been there. Okay, I was still there for gingerbread. I'm looking at years now, and honeycomb. Okay, apparently I was there for ice cream sandwich too, and jelly bean. Okay, I just don't remember it. Maybe that's when I switched over to iPhone. Was before I.
Well, and the thing is, as well, like Google for a long time didn't really kind of publicize the version numbering or anything like that. It wasn't a very public facing kind of thing. It was just, this runs Android, which caused a lot of issues, which I'm sure we'll get into. But because all these different versions running all these different kind of environments, they didn't work together. But yeah. But yes, it's been around. Like I say, it's been around for a long time. It's been around since kind of 2007 publicly.
Okay.
But I will sort of give you a little bit of a history lesson, and I will also actually say that if you're ever interested in really digging into Android history, there's a book called Androids, which is by Chet Hayes, who was one of the kind of quite early Android developers actually at Google, working on it. So I will plug his book, because it's an incredible book that really goes into detail about how Android was built from nothing.
And what was his name again?
Chet Hayes. I will pop it in the Twitch chat.
Great. I was like, I'll Google it.
He has, I know there is like a PDF version and all that sort of fun stuff as well, but it's a very good book. So I will plug that / because that's kind of one of my primary sources, because a lot of this information wasn't publicized until very recently.
Oh wow! Okay.
And so basically, if we go right back to when Android started as an idea to build a new operating system for digital cameras.
Oh, so I never knew that.
The two people that kind of invented Android, they didn't like the systems that existed for digital cameras. They were rubbish, and they probably are still quite rubbish. And actually, a lot of cameras do now use Android, which kind of is a bit strange. But anyway, this was the original idea. This was the original plan. They were going to build an operating system for digital cameras that were going to make them much more user-friendly and much more feature-rich. And at the same time, Google was starting to look at how they were going to build an operating system for this brand new things called smartphones. You had the Blackberries and
Palm Pilots.
Kind of Palm Pilot. There was rumors that Apple were going to be bringing something. There was all these kind of things in the air, and Google wanted in. So they actually ended up talking to these two guys who were coming up with Android, and said, "Hey, we really like what you're doing, but can we, instead of doing it for cameras, can we do it for mobile phones?" which is a bit of a segue, but
Yeah.
they did, and they said, yeah, maybe. And basically what they did is they came up with a prototype of how this might work in JavaScript.
Okay. Okay.
It was literally just a web application that they built as like a little demo UI thing of how an operating system might work. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And that's what Google bought, was a JavaScript demo. That was all there was. They had no code. There was nothing behind it. It wasn't anything. So Google bought this, and then the founders of Android realized we actually have to now build an operating system. So they went about building the whole mobile operating system essentially from scratch, from just this idea. And it was obviously an awful lot of work. And as we say, the book goes into great detail about how kind of then this was like 2005. So then over the course of the next 2 years, they spent this time building out this operating system. And what you'll see is, if I can share my screen, you might remember that the first Android device was the HTC Dream, or the T-Mobile G1 in the US. But what we had was this test device, which was the first device to run Android. And this is a very early version of Android as well. It looks an awful lot like a BlackBerry. This is what they were thinking smartphones were going to be. And then the iPhone released.
Yes.
And suddenly everyone went, oh no, that isn't what people want as a smartphone. So within the space of less than a year, they released this instead. And this was the first actually publicly available Android device. And they basically had to take a complete right-hand turn to include a touchscreen, to build an interface around that, and do something completely different to what they'd planned. And so the early days of Android were very rocky. It wasn't a very well polished thing at all. It was quite bumpy. It was very limited. There wasn't a whole lot you could do. But what it did have was integration into Google services. So things like you could use Google Maps, you could use Google to search, and it had an app store, which actually the iPhone didn't at the time.
Oh, really?
The first iPhone had no app store. So Android was the first platform to kind of actually open itself up to developers in that sense. But the other thing, which was massive, was that they didn't just open up the platform for allow app developers. They opened up the whole operating system, and they released it all the source code, fully open source, and said anyone can use this if they want to.
This is so bizarre to me, and the fact you're explaining so much of it that I didn't. Just being somebody that was a salesperson of this, or customer service, and having to fix so much of it, or having to take it apart, because back then we had the actual tech area to fix phones, and this is so surreal, learning about it beforehand with the knowledge I have now. This is weird and really cool. And hi homie, just to catch up on everything. Interesting. Okay. So
So it was a big, it was a thing that existed, and it really was quite rocky to start with. It took a few releases, a few versions of Android before things started to get stabilized, and kind of the market started to grow. But the biggest thing was the fact that it was fully open source, and it's still open source today. And for anyone that doesn't really know what that actually means, it literally means that you can go to this website, android.com/Android, and you have all of the code that makes up Android. Everything is here in lots of directories, and there's lots of code. There's millions of lines of code, but everything you need to actually build a version of Android yourself is publicly, freely available for you to use. And that was kind of unheard of across all mobile platforms. Back then, of course, things like Nokia's and stuff were still huge, and they had an operating system, but it was much simpler. But this was just completely unheard of, brand new territory. But what it did mean is phone manufacturers didn't have to build their own operating system. The likes of Samsung, HTC, Motorola, they could focus on building the hardware, and they didn't have to invest thousands and thousands or millions in software developers to build the operating system. They just needed a small team.
Is HTC still a thing?
Oh, I mean, as like technically as a company, there is a company exists that's called HTC, but it is nothing like it used to be, and I think that's one of the like very sad parts of Android history is just how like quickly, like HTC was the first company. They manufactured that prototype device I showed you. They manufactured that HTC Dream, and yet over the course of the years, Samsung just grew and grew and grew and kind of just completely dominated the market. Partly
Even,
because,
oh, go ahead.
no, I was going to say partly because even Google kind of sided with them, really.
Yeah, because even in Motorola was pushed out because Motorola was some of the very first ones too.
Yeah, they were. It was basically, it was HTC and then Motorola very quickly behind. Samsung was actually quite late to the game, a few
Mhm.
years down the road, and it does. It's sad to me because a lot of very cool HTC devices were created.
Interesting. And I'm also like thinking back to, and this is just like experience with these devices of like which ones worked well or which ones didn't. And because like that's how we would have to advise people on them. And it's so weird to me because especially now knowing more of that the manufacturers only had to work on hardware instead of the software, I'm really seeing how much of that was when we would talk about battery life.
Mm,
And Motorola, this is going off of memory, definitely not facts, but it was from what I remember, it was like Motorola did so much better with battery life than HTC or like the touch. HTC, at least what from what I remember, we didn't sell a lot of them because like the touch screens would stop working and that type of thing, which is interesting to me, especially if they're the ones who came out first
mm.
and that being pushed out from everyone else. So, very interesting.
Yeah, and I think the thing is, what happened is that in Google's perfect world, so this was an open source project that anyone could use freely. However,
Mhm,
if they wanted access to Google services, and namely they wanted access to the Android marketplace or the what's now the Play Store,
mhm,
you had to sign an agreement with Google. So you had to
mhm,
kind of conform to Google's requirements, wishes, whatever it might be, to become a certified device like that. And so what that meant is, in Google's mind, they wanted everything to kind of be the same. They wanted the
mhm,
same feeling, the same operating system across whatever device you bought, because that
mhm,
would be easier for users. Like what you'd be picking is the hardware. Did you want a physical keyboard? Did you want a better camera or a better
mhm,
battery? But actually, what happened is manufacturers didn't like that because it meant that their phones all looked very much the same. And from a branding point of view, that didn't work. So you get this fragmentation where they take the operating system because it's open source and freely available, and they start customizing it. They add their own theme. They add their own like pre-installed apps. And
Yes.
it's these things that started to really slow down Android, really kind of bug things
Interesting.
down because it just, it didn't work well.
And, a homie asked, that this this is crazy. So you could still today really tinker and make your own Android OS essentially.
Exactly. You can definitely still do that
Yes.
today. Getting it running on a device is a little harder, like an actual commercial phone, because you kind of have to root the phone and like bypass the protection that manufacturers have installed. But you can do it, and you can definitely still do it, and you can definitely do it in more like developer devices and stuff that you can buy online. 100% possible still.
Developer devices. Now I'm Googling that really quick.
Um, Google actually used to do a range themselves. They were the Nexus devices. So there was
Oh.
Nexus S, Nexus One. Well, there was loads of them, and those were like Google sanctioned developer devices. Unfortunately, they stopped doing those and started to focus on the Pixel devices. But there are a lot of kind of developer platforms and stuff out there that you can still do it. It does still happen, and there are still ways that you can like root your phone and then install your own stuff on it. It's just kind of stuff gets a bit more locked down these days.
If it's it like when I remember hearing it for Android, I would hear things like root your phone, that type of thing. But when it's going to iPhones, I would always hear like jailbreak.
Yep.
Is there a difference?
Yeah. So there isn't a particular difference. Both of them is about gaining control over your device and doing what you want with it. The
Okay.
reason why in Android we call it root is actually because Android was built on top of a thing called Linux. So Linux is an operating system. It's an operating system that kind of more traditionally runs on either servers or desktop, or actually it can run pretty much anywhere. It's essentially kind of that low layer of the code that sits between the actual hardware and like actually on the processor. So it's what's converting your nice code that you're writing in JavaScript or something into something that a processor actually understands as binary information. The memory understands it, and the kind of the hardware level.
Okay.
So it was built on top of this thing called Linux, and Linux has this idea of users. So just the same way as like your computer, you can have a user on your computer. So you might have a user with your programs installed, and then someone else might have their own user with their programs installed, and you don't have access to each other's programs.
Right.
So like you've got this own area. Yeah. So Linux has this idea of users, and it has a special user called root, and root has access to everything. That's kind of like your admin or your kind of full permissions user. So on Android, we say root your device because it's literally gaining access to that user that has access to everything. Because then from there you can delete stuff, you can edit stuff, you can do whatever you want. You have full control over the system.
Is a developer device then just a getting to the root and it just comes pre-set up like that instead of having to do it yourself?
Yeah, so essentially it'll either just come pre-set up and you'll have direct access to root, or the other thing that these manufacturers of phones do is they lock the kind of boot up process. So when the device is turning on, you don't have control of saying which user you want to access. It just automatically logs you straight into the user environment that's safe for the phone. Whereas if you think about a desktop computer, it'll take you to a login screen and ask you. So what you might find is actually on a development device, you kind of essentially get that login screen. It's not as like pretty as an actual login screen, but that's the point. You can like select how you turn your device on, so that you can then boot it into the root user, do whatever you want to do, and then maybe you want to boot it into a different user because you want to test something else.
This is like you're like answering all these questions that I had when I was working in the industry that no one could ever answer, because by the time it got to the stores, it wasn't like we had developers around to be able to explain what was going on. But like, I remember on different Android devices, how it would be like, if something really broke, it would be just like a screen of code.
Yeah.
And back then I had no idea like what it said or how to read it, that it would just be like an almost automatic, we're just going to swap your device.
Yeah.
Because of it. And I've been Googling over here of like different developer Android phone, and I'm going down a rabbit hole. So I'm going to stop looking at that, because now I really want to find one and see what I can do with it. So putting that on the side now, and you mentioned this earlier, that Android was originally built with JavaScript. Is it
Yes.
still JavaScript?
No.
Okay, I
No.
didn't think so, but
So essentially what they did is when Google bought it, the guys that came up with this threw that demo in the bin and got rid of everything that they'd done. So literally threw away what Google actually bought and started fresh. I'm
interesting.
not entirely sure at the time how much like the execs at Google were aware of what they'd actually bought, and I think it was much more conceptual and much more like, here's this idea that we have, and yeah, we can totally make it. We don't know how we're going to make it, but we can totally do it. So no, that was all thrown away.
Okay.
And what you actually have now is the Linux layer, the low level, that's all written in C,
Okay.
which is a very low level programming language. And then everything on top of that is a mixture of C++. So that's kind of C++ is basically a language that's still quite low level. That's why it's called C, but it allows you to do things like objects, and it's an object orientated language.
Can we pause really quick for a funny story?
Yeah.
So I'm giggling at C++ because when I was like, I'm going to be able to get my computer science degree and this is going to be awesome in school, I took the class and it just didn't click. It did not click whatsoever. But I really needed to pass the class. So I just started skipping class and the instructor was like, you can pass the class if you catch up on all of your homework. And I was like, okay. So I went to Craigslist and found someone who understood what was being asked and just purposely made mistakes in them. So that way it wasn't perfect, but did all my homework for me. Not the smartest move, and I'm not suggesting this for anyone, but that was my introduction to programming. And I always felt like because I didn't know I was dyslexic back then, but once I learned I was dyslexic, I was like, oh, that's probably why I couldn't understand it. And I never knew how to start understanding the theory behind it to be able to understand the coding going on. So now that you're talking about that, it's like different layers and that it's C and then C++ and what you'll continue with. I'm like, I wish I understood that back then.
No, sure.
At least now I have funny story.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, so that is what actually makes up the Android operating system is C and then C++. Then what they did to so they built this thing. They built this operating system. It worked, but then they had this issue of, well, how do you build applications for it?
Mm-hmm.
It's a completely new form factor. It's a completely new world.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, they actually had the guys that built it actually had experience using Java. So they'd built Java applications on old style phones. So you had these Java mini games. I don't know if you remember them. It definitely dates me, but they existed. And
like what?
I'm trying to think of some names of them now. It was after Snake, and it was kind of the next level.
I'm not gonna lie. I went from Snake to Brick Breaker. And I'm like, but that's the really, really old school phones to BlackBerry. I'm like, were there any other ones? I don't remember. Anyway, please continue.
Yeah, no. So they just kind of leveraged their experience and they thought, well, right, we will allow developers to build apps using Java, which is a programming language. And the specific reason for that is Java, when you write your code in Java, not to be confused with JavaScript, they are completely separate. When you write your code in Java, it actually then runs in a virtual machine.
Mm-hmm.
So your code has no idea about the outside world, basically. It doesn't know that it's running on an Android device.
Mm-hmm.
The idea there is you could write an application in Java and it would work anywhere that has a virtual machine. So it used to happen a lot on old websites as well. There would be a lot of Java on websites. You'd have to install plugins to get it to work and keep those up to date, and they'd never work. And it was quite popular at the time, like early, like 2008, 2009. And so they decided to go down this route because it meant that there was a security element there. If your Android app didn't know what was going on around it, it couldn't do anything bad, was the theory. You couldn't do anything malicious. It couldn't like read the information from another app.
Mm-hmm.
You wouldn't want some malicious app to be able to read your banking information from your banking app, for example. So there was this idea of built-in security. It didn't work very well, but there was that idea.
Is that
So
what the, just to repeat back, I might have missed this part of why certain phone manufacturers had their additional software in it?
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's at the layer where they started installing these additional things. So basically, coming all the way around, Android ended up with these 3 layers. You had Linux at the bottom, actually interacting with the hardware. The C++ that was the actual operating system, like the actual code, like the code that converted your SMS text message to a signal that your radio on your device understood and sent it, that kind of level.
Mm-hmm.
And then on top of that, you had Java. And that was where you could actually then build applications.
Okay.
And that was what was built up and decided this was going to be what we release, and they released it, and it worked well ish. But as you explained, we kind of had these issues where that's at the point where actually manufacturers started installing their own applications that weren't particularly well made. They were consume a lot of resource. They would run a lot of background things, and they would absolutely slow down the device to basically unbearable speeds. And it caused a lot of issues.
You really are like just bringing back memories of, there was this phone. I was so excited about it. It was an HTC phone, and it was called the Rhyme, and it was purple.
Okay.
And I was so excited about it. And then I got it, and HTC put so much on top of it that it would run really, really slow compared to a Motorola device.
Yeah.
This is like, okay, so weird.
And you had a layer even above that, because not only were manufacturers putting stuff on it, but the carriers were also putting stuff on them.
Oh yeah, because they would have like the default Verizon app. This is why we didn't get a lot of, I say we because I was, Verizon back then. We didn't get a lot of the capabilities that they wanted, as in like it took years before Verizon was allowed to sell the iPhone, actually.
Yeah.
And Verizon wouldn't get a lot of the phones that AT&T did because of them wanting to have a specific control over the phone. This is
exactly
so weird, like so fun, but it's like so weird bringing this all back around. Okay, so we got all 3 layers, and then, the manufacturer and the carrier would put extra apps on it.
Yeah. But all those apps were running, they were all Java, and they were all running within that kind of 3rd layer.
Okay.
Now, the problem with that, of course, was the fact that they were taking up a lot of resource. These apps would run in the background, so they were just permanently taking up space.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a problem. And throughout the years, kind of Google did a lot to try and stop that happening. Mm-hmm. It's definitely not so much the case anymore. And, I'd say essentially for about 10 years, if you wanted to build an Android app, you were writing Java code, which was fine. The problem with that was the Java code you wrote for Android was not at all the same as the Java code that you would write for other platforms. So they had this big idea that you would be able to use Java, which meant you could write it once and use it everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
But that never worked out. Android never supported like the whole language. It never supported everything that you could normally do in Java. So
Okay.
so they kind of ended up with their own programming language that just had the same syntax as Java. So if you looked at the code, you'd say, yeah, that's Java code. But if you Googled how do you do this thing in Java, the answers you got wouldn't work. You had to Google how do I do this thing in Android.
Oh.
Precisely. So as a developer, it was a nightmare, and it was especially a nightmare if you perhaps like early on there was a lot of people who were already Java developers. Maybe they were making desktop applications, they were doing web stuff, they were doing whatever it was,
Hmm.
and they saw this new platform and thought, "Oh, great! I can
Hmm.
start being an Android developer." And then they'd get into it and they'd realize that it was some hellish mutation of the language they knew, and it was, not great. So this was a problem for a long time, and on top of that, Android had its own way of making UI of like you had Java on the code doing the logic, doing
Hmm.
your code, but basically how you presented that on the screen was all done using XML layouts. So XML is kind of, I'm not sure if it's something that you've come across in your learnings, but it's a lot like HTML in that it's
Hmm.
a markup language, and so you have like, if you think HTML, it's the same sort of thing. You have tags, which you open and close, you kind of nest things, and all that sort of stuff. XML is just kind of more arbitrary. Like you can define your own tags and you can kind of build your own system around it.
I'm Googling while
Yeah.
you're explaining. And isn't the other, maybe I'm getting this wrong, but isn't there an XML file for like Excel files too?
That's XLS,
Oh,
I think.
okay.
Slightly
Okay.
different.
Okay.
But if you actually open a spreadsheet file in in a text editor
Hmm.
as just raw text, it is actually XML as well.
That's probably, so no, I haven't gone into it, but I'm like, I know I've seen this somewhere and
You
I
will
never know what to
when
do with it.
when we start looking at it, sort of probably next time, you'll definitely recognize it because
Okay.
it is like ubiquitous across development.
Okay.
Like,
Okay.
it pops up a lot.
Very
So
cool.
on top of Java not supporting the real Java, they also had their own way of creating UI using XML. So it was really difficult to get into because basically you had to throw away everything you already knew.
Hmm.
So in 2017, basically Google said, we've had enough. We're building, well, we're changing programming languages. We're going to use Kotlin instead. And that kind of solved a lot of the issue because Kotlin was new and it worked a lot more like JavaScript. Like when you look at Kotlin code, it looks quite a lot like JavaScript. And it was also it was literally its own language. So now when you Google, how do I do something in Kotlin, it will work in Android as opposed to the issues they used to have. So that is
Oh.
a very whistle-stop tour of the history of Android and the structure of Android.
I'm Googling again, if you couldn't tell.
That's
And
fine.
I'm not doing just like what it came up as, like I did Kotlin, Java, and it has questions like, is Kotlin harder than Java? Is Kotlin replacing Java? So if I understand correctly, then Kotlin is that now only for Android still?
No, so you can use Kotlin elsewhere. Essentially, when you build a program that's written in Kotlin, it actually generates a Java program. So you can still use it in other places that you would normally use Java. And in fact, you can actually go as far as to have some Kotlin code in your Java application. It gets a little confusing and a bit weird, but the two are replaceable, basically.
Would that be, and this is just me not knowing all like the languages breakdown enough yet in the ecosystem, but could it say that Kotlin is almost like a framework of Java, kind of like TypeScript is to JavaScript, or
Yeah,
React is to JavaScript?
the concept is definitely very similar. I think if you publicly say that Kotlin is a framework of Java, people are going to get very angry.
Good to know. Good to know.
But if you're purely thinking in concepts, yes,
Okay.
essentially, Kotlin is a new way of writing code, but actually under the hood, when it gets built, you end up with Java, and it
Okay.
runs in the Java environment. Now, there's another thing is to add more confusion, because this whole
Yay.
talk is just pure confusion.
Yay.
There is another thing called Kotlin multi-platform, which actually allows you to then write in Kotlin and then build it into iOS code. So you can build for iOS in Kotlin, and also into JavaScript. It will convert it into JavaScript, so you can build for the web as well. So they've essentially come up with this whole thing, this whole like build process that would allow you to, as the name kind of suggests, write Kotlin and it be built for multiple platforms.
What are iPhone apps built with then?
So iPhone originally was built in Objective-C, and now it's built in Swift.
The iPhone
Swift,
itself or the apps?
the apps. The iPhone itself is a much more convoluted mess because it's closed source. We can't see it.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
We only really know what people have kind of publicly said. And much like with all Apple things, it's a mixed match of lots of bits and pieces.
Homie just asked a good question of Kotlin seems super flexible. Why do you think it's not more widely used? I just read that in a different way than you actually typed it. Thanks, dyslexia.
It's all good. Don't worry. I read it in a completely different way as well. So there
Cool.
we go.
Yay.
Why do I think it's not widely used? Well, it's still quite new. So it really was only like 2017 that it started to take off. And it only really took off because Google said, right, we're going to use it for Android. And the other issue is, especially with the multi-platform side of things, convincing developers to move away from their native platforms, convincing JavaScript developers that Kotlin is better to do, and convincing iOS developers that it's better to use Kotlin over Apple stuff. That's like near impossible. So it's taken a lot to kind of convince people to start using it. But also, it's just not a very mature thing. If you think about the fact that Java has existed for about 30 years now, something that's only existed for 5 years is, much less of an attractive thing when you're deciding what, your super important, super reliable application. You want something that's kind of reliable, but it's expanding. I really think that we're going to see a lot more of Kotlin in the future, and I'm a big fan of it.
I have been enjoying my Googles during our stream today, in the fact of just like it's helping me piece it together a lot more. And also being able to look at the histories of these languages and like what they influence and when they came out really helps to go along with the story as well. So I appreciate that. It's okay. So we've been mainly talking about the operating system thus far, right?
Yes. Yep.
How are apps built?
Yep. So, as we've kind of said, let's and we'll kind of focus on how they're built now, because the other thing is, just as much as Android itself has changed, the apps themselves have changed significantly as well over the years, and there's been lots of like ways of building things that are just completely disregarded now. So there'd be no point in learning them because you would never use them. So in terms of the app side, we definitely want to focus on Kotlin and how we build from there. essentially you have your app is immediately split into two parts. You have the UI, and then you have the what we'd call the business logic, the actual code behind it that's deciding what to do. So when a user presses this button, what should that button do? You've got, well, how does that button look? How does that button feel? You know, that sort of thing. And then you've got, well, what happens when you press it? So that gets split down, and you can still use the XML layouts. That's still very much something that exists, and it's probably what we'll do in our sort of future app, because it's definitely the easiest, it's the most established. But there are new ways of doing that as well. So you can actually write your UI in Kotlin using like a framework called Jetpack Compose, which allows you to do a lot of really cool stuff. But again, that's a very new thing. It's evolving. You know, it's not there yet. So apps are built in Kotlin, and they're built using an IDE, an integrated development environment called Android Studio. There are other ways that you can build apps, but this is kind of definitely the Google approved way of doing it. And so what you would do, and what you can do, whether it's now or after this, is you download Android Studio, and that gives you a piece of software that looks a lot like this. It is an IDE. It's actually made in joint with IntelliJ.
Okay.
And they do other IDEs as well. So if you're familiar with their products, it looks very similar. But again, a lot of people have very opinionated views on what is the right IDE to use, whether it's Visual Code or, you know, whatever it might be. That's probably the one plus side of Android development, is you don't really have that. You have the one IDE that you use, and everyone uses it. And this provides a lot of different kind of tools, not just your code editing, but also has an emulator built into it. So you can actually run a Android emulator on your computer and see what it would look like when you're running your app, and you can interact with your app like live. And that is actually emulating an Android device, which is pretty cool.
That's really cool.
And that obviously makes it much easier to develop, because it removes that barrier of entry. You don't actually need an Android phone to build an Android app. It also means that, you know, you don't always have to have your phone connected to your computer to do it. You can just kind of iterate, make a change, run it on the emulator, make a change, you know, that sort of thing. And then, you know, it's got all the other sort of normal things. So what we can actually do, I think the easiest way would be to download Android Studio on your side, and I'll walk you through kind of getting that set up. And if we have time, maybe we'll open up their sort of template Hello World application.
I'm downloading. You guys can't see it, but I will get there. I'm just very concentrated on it today.
It's all good.
Share screen. This one. Share. And there we go.
Cool. And I'll bring you up a bit bigger so I can see your screen as well. There we go.
Are you gonna open? No. Okay, fine. Yay!
Cool. So you don't need to import any settings because you've never used it before.
Sweet.
And we will open Android Studio, which is the latest version, is codenamed Dolphin.
That's right.
Then so basically what we do is it takes you through quite a nice setup wizard, which is actually pretty straightforward. So we'll the other thing probably to mention at this point is at this point in history now, Android isn't just for your phones. Android, you have Android tablets, you have Android, wearables like watches, Android in your car, you have sort of that system. So all of these systems use the same coding language and the same setup. So you can do it all within this IDE. So this will just kind of go through and basically download everything that you need. You'll need to click on the Android SDK preview license as well and accept that as well. And that'll then basically download the emulator and all the other sort of gubbins that build it together. This all used to be much less straightforward, I must say. This is probably a very good time in history to be starting Android development, because you have things like this that just download it for you.
Yeah, this is cool. And now going back to what we were talking a bit about earlier is how Kotlin has something that will also make an iPhone app too. Will this help with that?
So not really. That kind of is something that's why they kept it as a separate project. That's why that's specifically called Kotlin multi-platform, because it's kind of another layer on top. So you would still use Android Studio for your Android bit, but then actually when you're building an iOS app, you would use Xcode, and they just then share a lot of code. It's all, again, it's probably something we could specifically talk on for about 10 years just on that. But it is pretty cool, like how they managed to do it.
Okay. Interesting. But I put the link in as well because I think it's definitely something. It's interesting because since I've started this show, people have asked me like when I'm going to start niching down into like one specific area. And I'm like, how can I? I don't know everything that's out there. It's all so cool. So I'm going to start doing 100 days of code in JavaScript just so that way I have it built out and a proficient in one language. Yet I'm loving the show of like, there's so many different things to learn.
Yeah. Excellent. So here we go. Yeah. And we can hit new project. And this gives you loads of template projects that you can kind of get started with. So let's go with the login activity. Actually, that's on the right there. That's quite a good one because that gives you a bit of an idea of what's going on. And then you can literally gives you a helper to name your application and set all these sort of things up. There's the minimum SDK thing is quite interesting. So I don't know if you might have actually heard about it when you were sort of on the retail side, but this whole like fragmentation of different devices running different versions of Android. So as a developer, when they release a new version of Android, you obviously want to use those new features. They'll bring in some cool new things. However, those cool new features only work on the new version. So if your users aren't using the new version, you can't use those cool new features. So this is where you have to kind of set a minimum SDK to say, my app will only run on devices newer than whatever version. And it gives you a little prompt there that says, like, you've selected API 21, which is Lollipop. Your app will run on 98.8% of all devices. And that's fine. And you can kind of go all the way up to, the latest versions. And like you say, the latest version, there aren't really any devices yet. And it's definitely interesting to see how segregated and like split out Android still is, which is a shame, but it's part.
This is interesting. Okay. Which one were we? Lollipop. There we go.
So it's something as well that like iOS developers don't really have to deal with because Apple are better at keeping the momentum forward. So everyone always wants to get the new iPhone, and because there's also only one iPhone,
Mm-hmm.
They support like 4 or 5 old iPhones, keep them updated, and then when they release a new one, they just remove the oldest,
Mm-hmm.
and it keeps that momentum forward. Whereas with Android, because you as a manufacturer can select whatever version of Android you want, you do still get devices that are being produced brand new that actually are running versions of Android that are 4 years old. And that's just because
Interesting.
they haven't internally updated. They don't have a developer to do that, or whatever it might be. And that
Oh,
causes a lot of issues.
that is so interesting. And so like to use the legacy support ones would make it so that way, if it's using like old stuff, so if I'm guessing for the minimum SDK, if we did that, it would be using like Jelly Bean, which would
Yeah.
make it before they had the App Store, Play Store.
Yeah, exactly. So you
Interesting.
can
So don't
definitely
click that.
no, there's no definitely. And again, Google's done a lot of work to try and make it easier by like backporting changes, so
Mhm.
older versions get updates through the Play Store, but it's still very a fragmented mess, to be honest. But yeah, so this is just going to kind of compile.
Why
I,
are you already
you can
having
just close
issues?
that. It's fine. It's fine. I'm sure it's fine. It's still building. Yeah, it's doing the thing down the bottom right hand corner. You can
Oh,
probably
I'm like, why
press
are
start
you
play.
still like? I just had got you. This is
It's all
so
good.
cool. Like this will.
So
What up, Bakari?
you're
Um,
just
I'm definitely getting some type of Android by next week. No,
sounds good.
because I want it.
Uh,
Will it make much of a difference if I get a tablet instead?
Not really. We can definitely explore, the UI difference of having a big screen versus a small screen, and the headache that causes. But yeah, functionally completely the same.
This is uh apply the code style. Yes.
So it's now just kind of pulling in everything to build the template application that
Mm-hmm.
we've asked it to build, and I think just because it's the first run, it does take a
Mm-hmm.
moment.
And so would it be possible? Do we have to use this IDE or could we use like VS Code instead?
So you could,
Okay.
but the problem is when it comes to actually building the app and making it into a file that people can install,
Mm-hmm.
you kind of now have to use Android Studio for that step.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So there are ways you can do it from the command line. You can like directly run the programs that actually do the building and stuff that's like under the hood. But they've really tightened down on saying that no, this is the only way we officially support. So it can be a pain. Like yeah, this would be the only thing I'd recommend.
And this is another thing is I don't even know where it's saved this to. I can fix that, but just as I'm newer to GitHub and need to working on it, but as long as I save it to like my code folder, it'll still be the same as uploading for. I can upload a repo for it.
Yeah, you can actually even do that within Android Studio as well.
Okay.
So along the top menu, you've got one that says VCS.
Oh yes.
And that's your version control. And so you can create a Git repository, you can share the project on GitHub, you could do all of these things. It'll probably ask you to log in and do all that sort of fun stuff. But
Oh, why would you
it's
need
definitely
GitHub Enterprise? Whatever.
so.
I'll look at
Yeah,
it
it's
later.
definitely. But there we go. It has set up. So on the left hand side now, you see there's a directory called app.
Mm-hmm.
And if you click on that, that'll expand out to
Let
the
me
different
see.
areas of the app.
Oh, I
There we
didn't
go.
mean. Well, that was fun. Not what I meant to click, but that was fun.
No, that works.
I was
We
gonna
can
see
see
if I can
everything
just make it bigger. It doesn't
there. You should be able to
appearance.
just. Don't. You should be able to just drag. Oh, you might like physically. Yeah. You can change the UI size, but it is a little bit of a pain.
Yeah, like it doesn't do it like VS Code or in a browser.
We
So,
for next time we'll get you set up with it
okay.
being a little bit more happy for people that are actually watching, because yes, I appreciate it's quite small.
So everybody's going to squint. This is why I have to use my glasses while streaming, because I'm always like, I can't see it. But we will get there. We will get there.
Yeah.
But this is, oh, wow.
So
And
this is
this
the
set it
project
all
that's been
up for
generated.
us.
Yeah. And what you did is kind of expanded everything, which is cool because we can now see it. And there's a lot going on here. So I guess the question is, do you want to go through this now, or shall we save this as a surprise?
I kind of want to save it because I think it'd be good we got it installed. We got there.
Yeah.
So we don't
Yeah.
have to wait for that next time. And we got the history. I think actually going through this is going to be more helpful as we're building it. So we don't have to
Yeah.
recap it again next week. Oh,
Sounds
this
good
is
to
so
me.
fun. Oh my gosh. This is so cool. Way cooler than I originally thought it was.
Well, that's because if I say Android development is cool, people just laugh at me.
Well, I think a lot of it is like it's been hard for me to conceptualize and how it goes from point A to point B. Like I can understand like people doing the code, but then how to actually create and run it, especially on a device is like something that I'm like, I know it exists. I know
Yeah.
it's possible. I've just never done it. So it's harder for me to go, oh, that was actually way easier, way cooler than I thought it was. And now I'm
I,
starting to see that too.
yeah, I think that's the thing is these things have come on a long way. It is a lot easier, and it's a really fun way to develop because you can physically get it on your device as you're building it, test things out, actually interact with it, and there's a very kind of tactile element to that compared to like maybe doing web development or back end
Hmm.
development where it's just you're looking at code and running it and hope it works.
Hmm.
So yeah, it's definitely something that I really enjoy.
Interesting. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show today, Zachary. And so everybody look forward to next Friday because that's when Zachary, I think, is coming back on.
Yes,
Pretty
I
sure
think
it's
so.
next Friday. Gonna go double check my calendar now so I don't lead anyone astray. I don't know why. Y'all, I made my life confusing with all these calendars, but yes, it's next Friday, the 21st.
There we
Ooh,
go.
and the day before that, I'm learning about Kafka.
Ooh. I think you probably know as much as I do, to be honest.
I like getting into sticky situations with the show of not knowing what I'm talking, like even an idea of it. So this is going to be quite enjoyable learning how to do that. And I am excited because if I remember correctly, you said Kotlin is a lot like JavaScript.
Yeah, I think so. It's very
Okay,
similar in terms of its structure and kind of what you're looking at. And I think when we start getting into some code, it'll kind of resonate.
cool. Cool. And then Homie did say that he thinks it's a little intimidating, but this helped him understand a bit more. And it's very interesting.
Good. I'm
Yes.
glad.
Thank you.
It's always nice when other people think it's interesting, and I'm
Yes,
not
not just
alone.
I really do. Like I think I also think that I'm partially like really into learning about it because I used to work in the field. So I'm like, finally going to be able to answer all of these questions and
Yes,
see
just
what
10
it
years
takes.
too late.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because I actually quit at Verizon in 2013. So
Oh, there you
almost
go.
10 years, almost exactly 10 years. So that's pretty crazy. And then because we're using Android Studio, do I need to download Kotlin?
No, so everything will have been pulled in for you. It's all in there now.
Nice. Nice.
That's a perk of using it. Like if you want to go down the route of using a different IDE, it takes a
Okay.
lot of setup. It's just not worth it. It's all
Okay.
bundled in. You can get started, and yeah.
Yay. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time today
No
and coming
problem.
back next week. I'm excited. You might also get stuck being requested even more because I'm like, but there's more we could do. There's so
Oh,
much
yeah,
more.
there's a lot more we can do.
Awesome. Well, thank you for your time, Zachary.
No
Bye,
worries.
everyone.